I couldn't say why I'm writing this, even though I've returned from points unknown to sit and collect these thoughts. I suppose I'm writing it because the end has to start with the beginning, and maybe someone should know about it. I'm not even sure how long it will take, because even if you have the speed gift like I do, sometimes you have to stop and think, and sometimes the stops take longer if, as the adage goes, not all your bats are contained in the belfry, not all your marbles are in the box. I'm still sane enough to realize that maybe going to Etienne-Guibert was both the greatest blessing and the greatest mistake of my life. What I saw there was enough to drive anyone mad, and what good did it do? None, in the long run. The gods are cruel. Let no one ever tell you different. Regardless of what joy you have in life, we all die alone. But they are also irrevocably kind, and they will give you what you want, if only for the right price. But even now, I can still smell his sickness, taste that room, taste the oceanic salt of my own tears. He was all I ever wanted, and now he has gone to a place where I cannot yet reach him. Soon, I hope, but not soon enough. Being a vampire is almost impossible to describe. I lived, but I barely felt anything. I hungered, but was never satisfied. Vampires almost never cry, but when I did, sometimes my tears would fall bloody if I had had enough to drink that day. More often, they don't come at all. Tears are human. And after a while, we forget we've ever been human, ever been alive, or ever felt happiness. Humans were never made for the long lives vampires have to put up with. Some vampires go so crazy at the thought of eternity that they either find the point of a silver stake, face the sun alone at daybreak, or simply starve themselves into a coma. It should be noted, though, that if a vampire starves themselves, they won't actually die. They'll just stay that way for perpetuity. It is practically a cosmic joke. There was a point where I wanted to be human again. He made me want to be human. But before I can even talk about that, I have to talk about what I was, and what I am, and how I wound up at this point to begin with. I have to talk about him. He was the only thing that ever loved me that I loved back. But to talk about him, I have to begin at the beginning, and that is the hardest part to remember. Book 1, In the Beginning. Chapter 1. On a cold night in 1803, I was walking home to my parents' house with a basket of groceries. My parents weren't wealthy, but they were somewhat comfortable, and they'd educated me well enough that I had a job in the city as an assistant clerk to an attorney. We lived in Berlin at the time, although we were not German, but of Greek and Spanish descent, my parents having met during the war. Despite my name, Melpomene Aguilar, strange and foreign according to most of the Germans I met, I did well enough, especially considering that I was a woman. You must remember that back then young women had little to no business working. They were generally married off by the age of 20 or so, and had few more functions than to have children and to look beautiful on the arms of their husbands. My parents worried over me, though. I was 18 and had no romantic interests, no suitors, never mind a husband, and to boot, I'd always had a very serious, sometimes even humorless disposition. To be blunt, I didn't particularly want a husband. Men were too demanding, too aggressive for my taste, and with the mess my head had been in since I was a child, I didn't think I could bear the strain of running an entire household and managing a bevy of children. Plus, a wife was supposed to be entertaining, and while I was many things, I don't think anyone would have ever called me that. I was not the type to put on frilly dresses, wear ribbons in my hair, and give dinner parties. My job was something I could handle with ease. 8 hours a day, decent wages, a boss that didn't endlessly harass or micromanage, as the modern workers would call it. At the end of the day, I could get away to my rooms to read and to wonder at the marvels of the universe. And at the end of the week, I had enough to pay rent in my rooms, food to eat, and every now and then, something frivolous, like a new dress or boots or a book. I was happy enough, even if my parents weren't. That day had been payday, and I'd gone to the marketplace to get my parents some food for the evening meal as I was visiting them over the weekend. A young woman crossed my path, and I momentarily stared at her. She had frosty blonde hair of a shade I didn't see often even in Germany, water blue eyes and deathly pale skin, although her cheeks bloomed with rouge. She smiled at me and spoke to me in a language that wasn't any tongue I understood. I cringed and mumbled, "I'm sorry, I don't understand." She switched to heavily accented German. "Good evening, miss." I gave her a hesitant smile. "Hello." "I was wondering if perhaps you could direct me to the city library," she said. "I hear it's massive." The library was on my way, I thought to myself. "I could show you, but it's since closed. It's getting late." "Oh, that's all right. Show me anyway. I'm dying to see it." And she winked at me. I nodded. Of course. She took my arm as we walked, and her grip was strong. I could feel it. She asked me questions about myself, my family, was I married, so on. I told her that I was not married, I had a job in the city, and my parents had a hard time finding interesting suitors because of my problems. "If I may ask, what sort of problems?" she inquired, looking concerned. I simply raised my hand and tapped my temple. She nodded as if she understood. "Do you hear voices?" When I look back on it now, I understand why I confided in her. But in that moment, I couldn't say why I trusted her with such an intimate secret. It was one that both I and my parents struggled to keep hidden, and here I was telling it to a stranger. But nevertheless, I nodded, lowering my head as though I were embarrassed. "Sometimes," I said. "There, dear, it's nothing to be ashamed of," she said, squeezing my arm. "That's nothing you can control. You're doing far better than most mad people. At least they haven't shut you up." I nodded and gave her a brief, if wry, smile. "What is your name?" she asked me. "Melpomene Aguilar," I said. "What a strange name to have in these parts," she said, laughing. "My name is Dashaya Nobokov." "You are Russian?" I asked her. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure few guess where you are from." "I was born in Greece, to Greek and Spanish parents," I said. "We moved to Germany when I was very small." "I have not been to Greece, but I hear it is a beautiful place," said Dashaya. "I hope to go there one day." I nodded. I haven't been back there in some years, but it is indeed beautiful. We finally came to the city library, the Stadsbibliothek, a large, stately building with the curiously domed roofs often seen in the Nordic countries, rows of neat glass windows, and wide double doors of well-carved wood. "And here it is," I said. "Ah, it is beautiful. A pity it is closed," she said. Something about her voice was stimulating to me, and I could not have explained why. It was as though when she spoke at points, she spoke in more than one voice. I shook my head, figuring it was just my illness talking. She turned to look at me. "I suppose I must go now, Miss Aguilar, now that I know where the library is. Thank you for showing me." She smiled at me. I said, on impulse, "Why don't you come with me? I'm sure my parents would like to meet you." She stepped towards me then and pulled me close to her and kissed me. I was totally surprised by it, and as such, I didn't react immediately. Her kiss was soothing and erotic at the same time until I remembered myself and also where we were. I pulled back from her. "Why don't you go later?" she whispered. "I have something to show you." I looked at her. I was hypnotized. I nodded. "Come." She took my hand and led me away from the library in a different direction from the one my parents' home lay in. One part of my mind was screaming at me to run away, sensing danger, but the part of my mind that was so fascinated by her dominated it completely. We walked for what seemed like an age until we came to a flat near the edge of town. She took out a key, opened the front door, and led me up 2 flights of stairs to her door. She unlocked it and led me inside. I shut the door as she took off her hat and coat and hung them on the wall by the door. The flat itself was plain but beautiful, white walls with neatly framed flower prints upon them. The well-worn wooden floor of the sitting room was covered in a Turkish rug, itself antique. A long, deep, silk-covered couch in green sat beneath a pair of thick glass windows, these framed with deep green drapes, spread open to let in the starlight. "So what did you want to show me?" I asked, uncertain if I really wanted to know. She smiled at me. This. Deshaya stepped towards me then, took off my coat, my hat, unbuttoned my shirt collar. I didn't even blink. She did not stop until I was naked. She ran her hands over my body, and her face nuzzled my neck. Against my better judgment, I sighed with pleasure. "You are too beautiful not to preserve," she whispered into my ear. "Your madness is beautiful. You are beautiful." I felt a pinch on my neck and cried out in pain, but then it turned sweet, as though she were making up for the pain she caused me. I began to fall to the floor as everything turned black. Chapter 2. When I woke up, it was night. I wasn't sure if it was the same night or many nights later. I felt like I'd slept for an age. I opened my eyes and saw Deshaya, who smiled at me. "Welcome back, Melpomene." I sat up suddenly and realized I was incredibly thirsty. "How long have I been sleeping?" 2 days. I leapt to my feet and cast around for my coat. "I have to go." "You cannot. You cannot go yet." I blinked at her. "Why?" "You do not yet know what you are." The thirst was climbing up my throat. "I don't know what you're talking about. I need water." "Water is not what you need. Sit down." Her voice was stern. I sat. She began to talk then, of shadowy beings that walked in the night, of generations of vampyrs who do not eat food but drink the blood of the living. As she spoke, I became more and more horrified. She had to be pranking me, I told myself, except that a part of me did not really think she was. "And now you carry my blood as well, and my thirst," said Deshaya, with a smile I did not much like. I rose to my feet. You made me like you?" I said, suddenly understanding with horror what it was I was thirsty for. She nodded. "I made you to carry on my legacy, and now I must teach you." I clenched my fists. "Explain. Teach me what?" But before she could say a word, a sudden, frightening, splintering noise disrupted the quietness of the room. The door slammed open. 3 men with very grim faces walked in. Deshaya leaped from her chair, and as much as I hate to admit it, I loved how afraid she looked. It didn't make me forget my own fear, though. "You will come with us," said one of the men, tall, blonde, husky. He turned his gaze on me, and his green eyes glittered. I could see almost immediately, somehow, that he was like her, only better dressed. One of the men seized me, and another seized Deshaya, and they dragged us out to the street, Deshaya screaming the whole way. I didn't say a word as they pulled us into a horse-drawn carriage, and we careened through the darkened streets of Berlin. Deshaya did not stop screaming until one of the men pulled her into a strong grasp and covered her mouth tightly. We arrived at a large house on the outskirts of the city, a gray Gothic stone house with cupolas and a garden that could have easily housed 5 generations of a single family with ease and room to spare. Deshaya fell silent at the sight of it. The men pulled us from the carriage and strode with us up the front stairs of the house. I'd never seen a house like it. This was the house of someone very, very rich. Fine carpets were ubiquitous. Paintings hung all over the walls. It was finely decorated, but not distastefully. This was the home of someone who had risen to an exalted position, who understood the value of simplicity combined with fine things. Very like my father, in truth. We entered a drawing room where a lot of people were gathered. The wallpaper was palest robin's egg blue, the floor beneath our feet highly polished maple, our shoes clacking loudly upon it. On a chair on a dais at the far end of the room was a man with rich dark hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. I couldn't stop staring at him. He had an aura of power that was almost palpable. The men pulled us into the room and deposited us on the floor. The man on the dais barely glanced at Deshaya, but looked at me curiously. I knew what he was seeing. Tumbled Mediterranean curls, wild green eyes, a face full of fear. The voices in my head would not cease their noise. The man spoke in a voice like the Black Sea. Charges? The Shaya Nobakov is charged with creating another vampire without permission, said one of the men who had arrested us. This marks her third offense. The man nodded. Very well. He waved a hand. One of his attendants brought a stake, its tip sharp and covered with silver. The Shaya stared, petrified. You knew the laws, the Shaya, said the man. Let it be done. Without hesitation, the attendant brought forth the stake and shoved it into Dashaya's chest before she could even speak a word. I screamed as her body crumbled to ash beside me. About silver, yes, the legends are true. We're vulnerable to silver. If you stab us with it, at the very least we'll lose a limb. Stab us in the head or the heart and we'll die in ashes. I clutched the collar of my coat, screaming in horror. The man descended from his chair and stood before me. I looked up at him, trembling like a leaf. He knelt before me and took my face in his hands. Although his eyes were hard, his expression was gentle. Do not be afraid, he said in German. I will not kill you. I shook a bit less. Why won't you? You cannot be punished for her mistakes, nor shall you be. He rose to his feet and helped me with mine. I stood, although my knees still shook. I could not stop staring at the pile of ashes that had been Dashaya Nobakov. What is your name, Riverian? The man asked me. I spoke quietly. Melpomene Aguilar. Very well, Melpomene. Welcome to my court. Did your creator tell you anything of us? She did not get the chance to, I muttered, almost angry at the thought. He frowned. I see. He signaled to one of his attendants who came forward. She was likewise a young woman with dark hair like his, hazel eyes set in a decisively non-German face, with a broad nose and olive skin. Find her a room and some clothes. I will be up shortly. He returned to his chair and sat in it. The young woman put her arm around my shoulders and made to lead me from the room, quiet as a tomb. It was a comforting gesture, although I was still ill at ease. Before we left the room, I turned back, scraped my voice out of my throat, and spoke. Thank you. He smiled faintly. Go, I will see you soon. I left the room with the attendant, who smiled briefly at me and led me away from the drawing room. Thank you so much for listening to the first few chapters of The Sunfallen Road, a novel of the Cleanse of the Dark Masque. I am Muse and Lystrala, and I've been your author and reader today. If you love vampires, werewolves, magic users, and all things that go bump in the night, make sure that you check out our TTRPG, The Hidden Keys, which we've got up on itch.io, and I will put a link in the description so that you can go check that out and some of the other stories that I've written for this game. I've also written the first volume of an official soundtrack for The Hidden Keys, which is some of the music that you hear in the background, and I will put a link to my Spotify and DistroKid stuff so that you can go and listen to it later if you fancy. Stay tuned for more. Like and subscribe.